Hello and welcome. This is a kind of review of Olivier Roy and his book, The Crisis in Culture, or Crisis of Culture. Um, its French title, I think it was originally The Flattening of the World or something like this. So for some reason he picked a different title for the English version. But anyway, it's quite a good book. I think it really explains a lot. Like, at least it gives us an interesting uh, kind of paradigm to look at a lot of the kind of weird contemporary cultural stuff through. Which is sort of in this, it's kind of implied in the subtitle, which is Identity Politics and the Empire of Norms. And uh, this is kind of what he's talking about. Much of the book kind of revolves around what he calls deculturation, which is a kind of deculturing things. I mean, it's sort of getting rid of culture. It's getting rid of culture and replacing it with norms. Now the problem is a little bit here. He doesn't really define culture before he does before he gives you this kind of paradigm. He does define norms better, which is basically kind of like explicit instructions. Norms, like, if you're walking through the underground station in like a big city, and you hear on the speaker, like, do this, do that, walk on the left side, walk on the right side, don't do this, don't do that. These are kind of just these really explicit instructions, which used to not be there, by the way. I mean, okay, young people today, well, I'm kind of, I suppose, born in 93, so I'm not exactly like an old person, but I have noticed this increase and increase over my lifetime of just being kind of bombarded with instructions everywhere. Everywhere you go, you're instructed to do something. Everything's very explicit. Um, and it's sort of like, I suppose you can sort of infer from that culture is something which is much more implicit, and norms are more explicit. So there's a sort of a tension between explicitness and explicitness. So the book basically kind of explores this idea of deculturation, and in its place you have norm building. One example he does bring up, maybe this is a good example just to introduce the idea, is the idea of chivalry. Now, the idea of chivalry is pretty old and has a long, complicated history, and which Olivier doesn't go into, but he does bring it up as a pretty good example. Um, you have this idea of chivalry, and chivalry is embedded in a culture, right? There's a sort of ethical code, implicit ethical code, and standard about how men live and what they strive towards and how they behave with other people, um, and it's implicit. It's implicit. It's not explicit. Um, and that eventually gets replaced. So you have a deconstruction of that over time, deculturization, deconstruction of that. Feminism, for example, will come in and say, well, that's this is just a kind of a screen, just a sort of fake image which justifies some sort of patriarchal oppression or something, and then you have a kind of deconstruction of the norm of the not the norms, the deconstruction of the culture and the implicit values which are embedded in chivalry, for example, and then you don't have chivalry anymore. So then you probably get some sort of behaviors which are a little bit like disrespectful or not as nice as people would might expect or want, um, from men, treatment of men to women, for example, and then in its place you get norms. And norms are basically like the whole Me Too thing, basically, like, don't do this, don't do this, don't say this, don't say that. Sexual harassment at work is bad. You get a kind of you get an explicit moral structure of kind of supervision and instruction and actually also social surveillance, although he doesn't really mention the surveillance part. But I would also add social surveillance goes into it. So yeah, so it's a good example. You have a culture, you have an implicit, you have a deconstruction of that deculturization. Then you have a bit of a void. In that void, maybe some things can happen, and then you have a reaction to that, which is explicit norm creation. Um, this basic schema is just explored throughout the whole book. Is to put it that simply, um, and it's quite good because it does give you a good sort of paradigm to kind of look at a lot of the things we experience today and kind of contextualize it, because we're sort of just told, I think about young people in particular who don't have any experience in the sort of more cultured era we could say of the past 70 years in the West, kind of post-war West. Like there was I mean, there's been deconstruction and deculturation going on since the 60s, right? This is a kind of something which Olivier will point to. There's been a deconstruction, but what's happened in the past, let's say 10, 15 years, is a kind of norm creation. So it's kind of historical. You go through different epochs of deculturation and then norm creation and so on and so forth. One of the points Olivier Roy makes in this book at the end is that he questions whether or not this is a temporary thing, like are we going through just a period of of deculturation, and then it will be replaced by another culture. So for example, you can think of the Catholic Protestant conflicts and then the formation of Protestantism, and he says that this sort of happened. You have a deculturation and a deconstruction of some of the Catholic customs and values and the implicits and so forth. But it gets replaced by something. That's what happened with Protestantism. It actually got replaced by something. Although you do see, I mean, this is another point really, but you do see with Protestantism, I think, a tendency for instruction to be sort of remaining a preference of instruction over in kind of implicit values. So, obviously it's complicated, but roughly speaking, you go through historical epochs of deculturation and then a kind of reculturation, we could say, which comes about. But Olivier questions whether or not he's not sure whether or not that's what we're experiencing, that there's a crisis in culture, kind of, which is caused by, I suppose, I don't know, various different things. But there's a kind of deculturization, which is sort of almost a permanent deculturization. There's a kind of a permanent deculturization as a crisis and a stagnation of our entire sort of cultural, social existence, and it's not really. It doesn't seem to be being replaced by anything. It's just you have a kind of indefinite, overexpansive norm creating process, and this norm creating process will get worse and worse and worse, and it will start micromanaging everything we do and surveilling everything we do and instructing everything we do, and also kind of infantilizing us as well, I think. Because a culture where things are run more implicitly, we are given more adult room to make decisions, to sort of put the values that we're inheriting in context to the situation we're in. Let's like chivalry, for example. It's like, I sort of have a decision making process in my head, like, oh, I should be sort of gentle and kind to certain people, but I should also be courageous in the face of danger. But I'm sort of given allowance to sort of make the decisions where each, side of that sort of, where each part of that value system is appropriate, or like how I should apply it or how I should feel about things. I'm sort of given wiggle room because it's implicit, it's not explicit. So I'm sort of given wiggle room to use those sets of values in my own context, in my own situation. So you're kind of, there's more freedom with the implicit, there's more openness, and then with the explicit, there's not so much. You get these really stupid things where people are like punished for something which is clearly not morally bad, but it's just like a sort of decontextualized thing. For example, I mean, again, to use the whole example of like, harassment in the workplace or something. You'll get this punishment of people in situations, or like political correctness, so people get cancelled for saying something like, if you take the situation in context, you'll clearly see that this person was innocent. But if you take away the context and you just say you broke this one rule, this one explicit code, then you're in trouble. And it doesn't seem to be the case that people really have the capacity anymore. I mean, a lot of people still do, but more and more so. It seems like courtrooms and management in in the in institutions or whoever, or even much of the general public, not all of them I wouldn't say, but a lot of general public, don't really seem to be able to sort of kind of contextualize things in making judgments of them. There's very explicit rules. When people break those very explicit rules, well, then that's just a kind of, they're just guilty, whatever. So I'll read the introduction to the book, because it's or the very first sort of passage, because it gives a good kind of concrete example of what we're talking about here. Okay, so he says, on 27th of January 2018, United Airlines refused to allow a passenger onto an airplane with a peacock, even though the passenger had a medical certificate stating that the presence of the bird was vital to enable her to bear the mental stress of flying. Okay, so it's a funny example, but it elucidates what he's talking about. In a press release, I can't believe this actually happened. This is absolutely mental that it actually happened. But anyway, in a press release, the airline had the peacock's presence in the cabin. Sorry, the airline said that the peacock's presence in the cabin did not meet the guidelines for a number of reasons, including its weight and size. So again, so I just want to point out that this is the kind of point, it's not to say, this is like reading something from a Chuck, what's his name, Chuck Palahniuk novel or something, right? So the point here isn't that like anyone said you're not bringing a peacock onto a plane because that's retarded. And you are an idiot. Get over it. You know what I mean? Like, what are you talking about? Your peacock helps you. You know what I mean? So this is the point. Like, the only way that companies can sort of deflect from these stupid things is by saying, "Oh, it doesn't meet the requirements. It's too big." It's the peacock is 200 centimeters tall instead of 150 centimeters. So sorry, I can't do that. Instead of just saying to the woman, "Are you literally mental? Like, are you mental? This is ridiculous." Like, so of course this is how we have to deal with everything today. Um, Very dishonestly and very like indirectly. Um, in the same period, the same scene was played out in several airports with other creatures, including a pit bull, a squirrel, a pig, a duck, a turkey, and a miniature horse. Jesus Christ! The passengers involved all demanded. I imagine bringing a miniature horse onto a plane. It's ridiculous. The passengers involved all demanded to have the creature in the cabin with them as emotional support, and often had a medical certificate to that effect. After a while, American airline companies decided to establish new guidelines stating that pets were acceptable, a kitten in a basket, and pets which were not acceptable, an alligator, whether or not on a lead. Okay. Anecdotes like this, anecdotes of this kind raise questions, though I've deliberately chosen that one that elicits more smiles than arguments. Of what such, of what are such stories a symptom? How should they be classified if not under other news? They are not sufficiently common to be regarded as a social trend. They are not. They are not. They do not launch social or political movements, and their protagonists alone must face the disapproval aroused by their actions. Yet, in the case above, they had a real effect. The writing of new guidelines. Okay. Um. Okay. Yeah. So this is kind of good, like, concrete example of the kind of processes. So, a lot of people may be tempted here to say, well, like, how many people try to bring peacocks or miniature horses on the planes? Like one in 5,000, 1 in 10,000 or something like this, it's not worth bothering over. But actually it is, because new guidelines are written in response to it, right? It's not always the guidelines are written that say, you can do whatever you want, but guidelines are written in response to it. And then these guidelines then sort of become entrenched in these institutions, and then they sort of direct how everything we do and how we interact and so on and so forth. And I mean, there's a lot of implications that we can take out from this example alone. I mean, you could analyze this one example alone and sort of, take a lot of sort of structures of this process out of it. For example, it's normally, and this is something Olivier will point out later in the book, it's normally like remedial. These norms are often remedial. They're designed to remedy suffering. There's a kind of aspect of the therapeutic culture in a lot of this. They're designed to remedy suffering. They're designed to include people that maybe have a sort of claim to being marginalized or excluded or not considered or not accommodated enough. So there's a kind of vague, sentimental inclination, you could say, behind a lot of this stuff. And when it happens, the most ridiculous things in the person bringing the mini horse onto the plane probably won't be allowed to, and they probably might end up looking a bit silly and a bit stupid. But at the end of the day, they're not going to say to the person, like, you're just a stupid, you're like a crazy person, you're an idiot, seek help, and they're not going to treat it like kind of directly. They're going to say, well, it doesn't meet guidelines, so we're going to refer to the guidelines and we're going to change the guidelines so that this doesn't happen again. And then those guidelines become a part of the whole way that they make decisions. So rather than sort of making what you might call intuitive decisions about like the idea that you need a mini horse on a plane with you for emotional support is so ridiculous that we're just going to call you an idiot and refuse. You have to sort of create a sort of guideline structure to like justify that decision. If you understand, you have to sort of defer to the guidelines. It's not that you're a crazy person, because that would be making a sort of assumption. that would be like making a judgment. We can't do that. So we have to say that it's just too big or something, right? Okay, so he gives a very good example here, a very empirical example. Again, not this time with like, processes in airports or anything, but with a journalist, a famous journalist, writing in two different times, 1983 and 2018, about the same topic in completely different ways. So he's sort of showing that this is there's been a cultural shift, and this cultural shift has come about also because he's a boomer, Olivier Roy, and he sort of admits that his culture, his generation is kind of guilty of the shift, that they sort of that they have this very kind of where it's kind of contradictory generational lifespan, where they lived in two different worlds. They lived in the world in which they were grown up in, which was very much more socially, culturally liberal. I don't mean that in the ideological sense. I just mean that in the very practical sense of like letting people do what they do and make mistakes, and sort of you could say a kind of implicit culture where there was a value system, but it was implicit and you had a lot of wiggle room, to an explicit system where you don't have any wiggle room and things are very much more rigid and so forth. The boomers have kind of lived in both of these societies, and like within their own lifetime. Like if you're born, so I was born in 93, and I got the tail end of that more implicit, the very tail end of that more implicit. And to be honest with you, it was a tail end which you really couldn't experience well unless you were into some sort of counterculture. Like when I was younger, I was into like in a punk music and rock music, and played in bands and things like that, and went to gigs, and you got the tail end of that sort of I would say sort of, let's say, socially more resilient, kind of funner, more creative sort of post-war culture. You got the tail end of that, but that doesn't exist anymore. That whole tail end is faded out. You just have a system of, like, unless you're talking about certain places on the internet, you basically have a total victory of the explicit power structure, the explicit norm system today in almost any institution. It's horrifying. It's horrible. But young people today, anyone born after the year 2000, let's say, doesn't know what it's like to exist in the old world. They have no idea. They have no idea it existed. The boomers really know because they've and the Gen Xers too, because they really existed in both. They've really existed like a lot of both. Like if you're my age, if you're a young millennial, you only got the tail end of something. You didn't really get a good go of it. If you're a boomer or Gen X, you really got both. So anyway, here's a good example of that. He says, Maureen Dowd has been writing columns. Let's just put my glasses on because I can't fucking see. Okay. Maureen Dowd has been writing columns for the New York Times since '83. In two of her pieces for that paper, written 20 years apart, she comments on the Monica Lewinsky affair, in which a young intern at the White House was drawn into a sexual relationship with Bill Clinton. This is what Dowd wrote in 1999, supplementing the Lewinsky story with that of Joyce Maynard, who had published a book on her relationship with novelist J.D. Salinger, 34 years her senior. The article is entitled "Liberties Leech Women in Love." Okay, so here's the quote. Throughout the long, dark ages of undisputed patriarchy, women connived to trade beauty and sex for affluence and status. These two highly skilled predators keep trying to extract a celebrity from old love affairs that were not only brief and puerile, but sexually tortured. They want to gain immortality and big bucks by feeding off the detritus of what the hell is a detritus? Okay, no, sorry, I'm illiterate apparently. I don't know what this word is. By feeding off the detritus of their trysts with older famous men. Okay. Rarely you get hit with like a sentence when you're fluent in English. There's like 3 words that you never heard before. That was one of those. That was one of those examples. Oh well, I'm not even going to edit that. There you go. Tryst. I think tryst is a kind of adventure or a bit of a fling. Tryst is a fling. Yeah. Okay. Well, it shows you in the 80s they used a lot. They used a bit of a different set of vocabulary, that they do today, especially in like newspaper columns. Anyway, okay, and then Oliver says, and here is Dowd in 2018 writing again about Lewinsky, who had just written a book about a relationship with the older man, as Maynard had done before her. So this is the quote from this journalist in the New York Times. The power differential between a 22-year-old intern and a 49-year-old boss makes any sexual interaction wrong. Okay. You would immediately see the difference. And if you throw in the fact that he was president, the country's parent, okay, and someone serving in loco parentis for the youngest White House staffers, it's an inexcusable abuse of power, as Lewinsky wrote in an eloquent March Vanity Fair piece. I'm beginning to entertain the notion that in such circumstances, the idea of consent might well be rendered moot. Okay. Okay. So anyway, there you go. End quote. So this is something that Olivier will talk about. So he says, how do you go from leech to victim in 20 years when no new element has emerged? Dowd is clearly sincere in both articles. She is not being forced to change her mind. Instead, she has simply changed her points of reference. This is a good point. It's like it's not. I think it's what a lot of people get wrong is that they think that the change we've had in the way we think, or when I say we, I mean that whatever. Take we to mean whatever it means, but the way we think has been forced upon us or something, and for certain people it has. For certain people, like if you say no, I prefer the old way, I'm all right, thanks. You will face some sort of social punishment, like at some point in your life, and that could be actually pretty brutal, as a lot of people will find out. Um, but nonetheless, there has been, you know, a sort of change which whose genesis is mysterious to us. We don't really know why it's changed. It hasn't been forced, but it has changed. Um, in this paradigm shift that interests me here. Sorry, it is the paradigm. It is this paradigm shift that interests me here. Are we living in a new culture, or conversely, is this the expansion of normativity, the sign of a profound crisis in the notion of culture itself? That is the question I pose. So yeah, this is basically the question he poses throughout the book. Are we going through a kind of moral cultural shift historically, or are we sort of stuck in a peculiar norm spiral, and it's a kind of whole scale crisis of culture itself? I tend to think that it's the norm thing. I think that we're not going through a cultural shift. Um, One of the reasons I don't think we're going through a cultural shift. Now, this is kind of getting into my own ideas. This is not really explicitly. This is not Olivier's idea, but is that if you look at the sort of norm creation processes, um, they're too inconsistent really, and sort of incoherent, for one, to really be a kind of genuine new culture. Like, I'll give you an example, like, my body, my choice, abortion. But then with the vaccines during COVID, same logic didn't apply. So like, it's not like there's a kind of internally coherent system of values and morals which are being presented, which are sort of different to before, but they at least give us a sort of coherent moral universe or matrix, we could say, to sort of live inside comfortably, or not necessarily comfortably, but to some extent, live inside. That isn't really happening. Um, it's not coherent. It's extremely psychological. It's reactive. It's psychological. It's not thoughtful or self-reflective. It's actually what I would call post-enlightened as well, because there's such a failure of internal coherence, and self-reflection going on uh, with this stuff, coming from these institutions, which are supposed to be enlightened institutions as well. Whether or not it's newspapers or universities or whatever, companies, whatever it is, it's kind of like post-enlightened sort of superstition or something. It's like there's this kind of vague forces of sentimental distaste for things, which we don't like that. That's icky now. That's bad. That's harmful. And then we have to change that. But then you say, well, what about this? Why aren't we applying the same logic to this? And you will just get shouted down or told you're a crazy person or something. There's no room for a kind of enlightened discourse in the setting up of a new system of values, or the sort of creation of internal cohesion. I mean, like, there's an example, because I've been reading Carl Schmitt's um, Nomos of the Earth, and if you go back, um, which is about international relations, kind of geopolitics in Europe, and how that changed over time. But if you go back to the Middle Ages, there was a kind of system of geopolitical navigation, we could say, interaction between all these different kingdoms in the Middle Ages. And you had scholars, like basically often monks, like theological scholars, who were doing a lot of work in trying to create a kind of internally coherent system of how we should relate to each other, like particularly in things like warfare and conflict and disputes over inheritances, or all these kind of things. There was a real attempt, and these sort of theologians and people in these monasteries, they clearly had a culture where they understood that their job was to discuss these things and sort of come up with a coherent process. But like, I don't see that today. Like, I don't see, like, and that process lasted until I think it was, I think he said it was the discovery of the New World, right? And then things started to change, and then you have a kind of secularization process where lawyers and jurists are taking over the role of the theologians and the so. But anyway, the point is that, like, you have these institutions or these people that do their best to sort of create a sort of coherent um system of values and processes of how we deal with and interact with certain situations. And so, but you just don't have that today, do you? You just don't have that today. Like, you don't have a kind of uh, an attempt at coherence. It's so emotional. It's so reactive. It's so short sighted and short memory. I don't feel like it's possible. Like, whether or not I agree with the new norms, I don't think it doesn't seem to me that these people that embrace them and create them and act them out and police other people with them are coherent enough to actually create a long term new sort of cultural structure, if that makes sense. Another point here to point out, and again, this isn't something that Olivier goes into too much detail, but I have noticed it, and I think it's good. It's a good opportunity to point it out. Is that this sort of, because one of the chapters is called what's it called again? It's called From Freedom to something. Let me just double check this. Double check. From Freeman to normativity. Sorry, from Freeman. I can't speak. From freedom to normativity. Um, that's what one of the sections is called, and um, and I think this is important because if you take the example of the last of this New York Times journalist who described the same situation in very different terms, 20 years apart, or 30 years apart. Um, you know, this shouldn't be seen as like a generational shift in values, sort of like how the boomers shifted in their values from their parents and grandparents. There was a generational shift in that their grandparents and their parents and grandparents had certain sets of values. They thought a certain way. They had certain sort of social values, and which embedded their relations in a kind of culture, which embedded the way they lived and so on. And then the boomers were born post war, and then you had kind of countercultural stuff, and then there was a big radical shift away from that, right? The boomers and also Gen Xers to some extent as well have sort of embraced those new values, separated themselves from the past, but at the same time within their own lifespan embraced the new norm creating structure. So it's an important thing to point out when some, especially some conservative sort of commentators, blame the young people of our time. They say young people of our time, they're just simply soft and fragile, and they're sort of, overprotected or whatever, and blah blah blah. But no, this is playing out through the older generations. Like, in their own lifetime, they are accepting and even affirming, or even sometimes creating the new norms, which completely contradict their old values, right? You you see this a lot. Like, there is a kind of Oedipal parental sort of hypocrisy in this all, which I've become increasingly aware of looking at these situations where I think you sort of have these parents that like have sort of like lived these very individualistic, kind of consumer driven lives. Maybe maybe they're women who have used their sexuality for status or money. Maybe they're men who have, not been the most chivalrous, or have not, have not sort of lived up to traditional ideals which came before them around heroism or courage or something. And then I don't know. And then these generations start to feel maybe they feel a bit hollow or something, or a bit empty, and then they embrace a new norm structure, and they really impose that norm structure on the young. Then they'll kind of say, "Oh yeah, when we were, when we were your age, we could be all politically incorrect, and men were hitting on women, and no one cared, like, whatever, as long as there was no, like, aggressive physical, force, no one cared what you said, and women were expected to sort of be themselves, and to sort of, if they weren't comfortable, they were expected to say something, and they're adults or whatever, so you're not going to treat them like children, and we're adults and we're not going to be treated like children, and we have our own freedom, make our own choices, that we make our own mistakes, and we're durable and all this stuff. You have this attitude with the old generations when they were younger, but then when they become old, they impose the exact opposite. They impose the exact opposite on their children, right? um, and their grandchildren and so on and so forth. So you have this complete contradiction in the generational tension between freedom and normativity. It's not to say that you have a generation of freedom lovers and then a generation of norm lovers just comes in and like overthrows the generation of freedom lovers. No, the generation of freedom lovers themselves have turned into norm lovers as they've aged, and that's something I think people don't appreciate enough when they talk about this stuff. Um, that's an important observation. I think when young people, if they're, this is again, it's kind of going off my own tangent really, but young people, if they're sort of confused or frustrated with the way things are, they shouldn't take a very simplistic. I see this happening too much. They shouldn't take a very simplistic thing. Like for example, they might say to themselves, "Oh, the system, the institutions, the boomers, or whatever, they're really kind of norm and they're really norm imposing people who um who are too restrictive and so on. So what we need is just like a kind of revolution of of kind of freedom and liberation and so on from these imposing norms. There is some truth to that, obviously. I mean, I do think that if you're working in a workplace and you're an adult, and you're flirting with another adult, and some human resource witch comes over to you and says, I'm gonna punish you for this." I do think there's a lot of room to push back against that and say, "Who are you to tell us what to do?" And like you're probably just jealous or something, and you're just a witch, and go screw yourself, you corporate control freak. Like I think that's perfectly legitimate. I wish that happened more. So in some sense, we do need a kind of freedom movement. But the problem is, and I think this is the reason why we don't have one, is that it's much more complicated than that. Because at the same time, the people imposing the restrictive norms on you are also there. Like they're also an expression of this kind of liberation, of this era of post-war liberation. Um, our entire culture now is very much caught between this like contradiction of like post-war liberation and then norm imposing restrictive structures, and it's difficult to therefore present a sort of counterculture or a counter movement against that and say, you people hate freedom, you love norms, therefore we want freedom, because it's not exactly true. Like there's this kind of internal incoherence and internal contradiction to the establishment today, which means that sort of, if you fight for freedom, they like the system will sort of frame that as like, oh, we love freedom too. But we love safe freedom, we love hygienic freedom, we love so it's a kind of new stylized form of freedom, which comes with its own norm imposing structures, but it makes it difficult to therefore say, well, you people are restrictive and we love freedom. So that's a simple contest, that's a simple, clear contest people can grasp with. And it's you can't do that today because it's too complicated. It's too contradictory. And I would say it's the same thing. And I think this is sometimes Olivier will criticize the populists as well, because he'll say that the populists are sort of resisting the norm structure, but they're sort of imposing a norm structure at the same time, making things explicit at the same time. Um, you can see these examples, for example, in the UK at the moment with immigration and with digital ID. Like digital ID would very very much be a sort of, I think, something you could put in a kind of norm structure, socially restrictive norm structure category. It kind of responds to the sort of threat or insecurity people may have feel in the face of too much immigration, too much globalization or something. And a lot of people on the conservative right will say, well, we need to resist the system, which is for all out freedom of movement and for all out freedom of doing whatever you want, by controlling people, by, like these immigrants are being sexually harassing towards women. We need to control them. We need to get digital IDs. So there's a sort of kind of schizophrenic, nearly sort of resistance to the system today. On one hand, you could resist the system from a freedom point of view and say, we hate these norms, too restrictive. Let us do what we want in the workplace, date who we want, talk to people who we want, don't socially surveil us, and so on. And on the other hand, you could say, no, there's too much kind of chaos and freedom, and there's too much pornography on the internet for children. We need to stop that, and we need to control that. So there's this kind of there's this kind of, which may be true to a certain extent as well. Like, I'm not saying that that's not exactly true, but there's this sort of schizophrenic resistance to both norms and freedoms at the same time. And I think that's why you can't really resist the system anymore, because it's like, if you try to resist the system through norms, well, then you're just feeding into the system. If you try to resist the system through freedoms, well, you're going to have that freedom sort of reframed in a certain way, and given to you in a sort of this sort of depreciated, gross way. But still, you're going to be given a certain sort of so-called freedom. So there's this kind of impossibility of struggle, we could nearly say, which is happening at the moment. But that sort of leads us into the next thing I think is important here, which is something Olivier will talk about in terms of transmission, kind of cultural transmission from one generation to another. There's been a failure, I think, of transmission. I'll give you an example of this, because Olivier Roy will talk. He actually began his career doing a lot of work on Islam and on Islamic fundamentalism, and he lived and traveled in the Middle East for a period of time, and he's kind of very aware of all this kind of stuff. So he talks about, he often questions the idea that, like, the people you see doing all these like terrorist attacks and things are like radical, like genuine radical Muslims. That they are actually a peculiar byproduct of modern deculturation itself. This is what he argues, which a lot of people just think these people are so, brainwashed, and they read the Quran so much, and they're so religious that they do these extreme things. But Olivier will push back against that and say that if you actually look at the people, if you study the people that do these attacks, they're often like second, third generation, Muslims, and they often don't speak the language of their grandparents or great grandparents. They don't really understand the culture of their great grandparents, their grandparents and great grandparents, and what I think so basically there's a kind of failure to transmit the culture and the language of their faith, you could say, which kind of surrounds their faith, and then they get this sort of empty thing called being a Muslim. I suppose it's kind of like an identity now. It's not really a culture or a faith, it's kind of like an identity. And then you get this thing, and these are the people that become the extremists, actually, right? And he will also point out that there's a connection in the history between like kind of Marxist revolutionaries and between Islamic kind of revolutionary action, that they actually mimic each other in certain ways too, right? Even though one's like an explicit secular atheist thing and one's a kind of radical religious thing, that like there's still a kind of modern sensibility of a sort of struggle against a kind of modern state and so forth. So he has an extremely nuanced perspective on this stuff, which is helpful. But yeah, like, so if you think about these people doing these terrorist attacks, they are the product of a failed transmission. Okay, so if you think about the person in like London or in somewhere in Germany, in a city in Germany or in Paris or wherever, right? You got this like young man, normally could be a woman too, but normally a young man who he doesn't speak the language of his grandparents or great grandparents, and he's sort of alienated and deprived of the culture by which his grandparents and great grandparents and so forth lived. And you have a parent structure, and normally these parents are the people that come to the West. And I've seen this myself, like in school, I grew up in Ireland when kind of before there was a lot of immigration. So most of the school, which is Irish people, some English people, mainly Irish people, maybe like a few Polish people maybe. There's one African guy in the class, right? and his parents were saying that he was going to be a doctor, right? And his parents would just like make him study the whole time. He had no social life. He would never go out and socialize with friends. He would just study, 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 study. He's going to be a doctor. He's going to be a doctor. So you get these kind of these immigrants. And I actually have a good friend of mine who's half French and half. So his dad's French, his mother's African. And his mother came over from Africa to France when she was like, I don't know, in her twenties or something, and then met his dad and married, and then you know, so she and like I've noticed that these kind of off the boat people, when they have kids, they really project this sort of like hyper Western, hyper sort of careerist, hyper sort of personal individualistic success on their children. They sort of say, we're in the West now, there's money to be earned, you know, there's things to consume, we have all these freedoms that we wouldn't have back home, and blah 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 blah. And they really kind of push this, their children become really really deprived of any culture. They become really really deprived of the culture of their of their grandparents and great grandparents. They become these like really individualized, sort of career obsessed, money obsessed, consumption obsessed. And I suppose if they're not happy about anything, the parents will also say to them, you should be appreciative because like you could be back in Africa, you could be back in Indonesia, you could be back in Pakistan, and you'd be impoverished. You'd have no freedom, you'd have no wealth, and so on and so forth. They can always push back against any complaints by saying that, which is another thing I've noticed they can do. Um, so there's a real screw up basically with these immigrants in their parenting. Of now, there's also a screw up obviously of the locals too. I do think a lot of young people also feel today particularly deprived and alienated from, even when they're in the West themselves, from their own Western culture. I mean, they feel sort of this sort of a hyper individualistic globalization, career, money, consumption obsessed world has sort of pushed them into this sort of non-identity, this sort of non-culture, this sort of void of meaninglessness, um, and you do basically see this as a kind of reflection between the post-war generations who separated themselves from their own Christian or their own historical pasts after World War II, counter-cultural revolution, and so on, and between immigrants who come to the West from like third world countries in particular, and sort of say, well, we're so lucky, we're so lucky. So there's this sort of embrace of this decultured, sort of dehistoricized, decultured, um, um, uh, dehistoricized, decultured, in like hyper individualistic, kind of materialistic existence, kind of blocks everyone off from the past. There's a kind of block from the past, and I think what we're seeing right now, and this is where you could look at something like the kind of psychological collapse of society in general, which we're going through. I think as connected to that cutoff, to that alienation, to that block from previous cultures and from histories and so forth. Um, and the people that are really guilty of that are like the boomers and like the off the boat immigrants and like the people that sort of this that have sort of initiated us into this sort of new era, this new era of unlimited wealth, unlimited consumption, unlimited personal freedom, and so on and so forth. But anyway, the whole transmissionary, generational transmissionary process is really broken. It's really 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 broken, and this is something he points out in the book. So I'll just read from another section on this breaking of transmission. He says, quote, culture understood as a corpus, as canon, is a set of products and practices, oral narratives, writings, works, which are then described as artistic, music, even certain forms of ritualized practices that are selected and taught, in other words, handed down according to rules and procedures with axiological intent, providing a moral ideal for all, the ideal of the Greek paideia, the German Bildung, the Honote Home in 17th century France. Okay, the French pronunciation is bad, so sorry for that. The adab in the Muslim world, etc. Normativity and pedagogy thus go hand in hand. The aim is to define an ideal over and above all possible aesthetic forms, including the cynical, the realist, the pessimist, and the decadent, of which can be considered vices tribute to virtue. Canonical culture is thus defined. Sorry, is thus objectified as a well-defined ensemble with associated features, rules for inclusion in the canon, with the age-old conflict between ancients and moderns, validation procedures, diplomas, exams, textbooks, places designed for transmitting, establishing, and preserving the canon, universities, museums, theaters, libraries, and so on. An associated corps of professionals, mandarins, ulemas, I don't know what that is, Brahmins, scholars, professors, curators, producers of the most accomplished and highly respected canonical elements, such as writers and artists, have a legal and fiscal status which in return defines their creations as artistic. Since the 19th century, the artist's legal status in Europe has coincided with the romantic valorization of the artist as a creative, quote, genius, the alliance of the attorney and the muse. Likewise, cultural venues have been established. An object in a museum is a work of art, even if it is a fork. This is how the primordial arts, to avoid saying primitive, were constructed recently at the Quai Branly Museum in Paris, not according to any anthropological criterion, but by our aesthetic view of an object that has been removed from the context of its production and use in the culture where it originated. Okay, so I want to just stop there for a second and just discuss that observation. This is so talking about a sort of a kind of pedagogical educational process in which transmits things, but it transmits things through an object which has been removed from the context and production of its use in the culture where it originated. So again, to kind of point out what I was saying earlier about the religion of, let's say, a Muslim in the West who doesn't speak the language of their grandparents, or hasn't even traveled to the country of their grandparents, and doesn't actually live in any way like them. And then you've got the parents who moved, and then the parents kind of act. I think, and I think this is basically what boomers are. they're like a cutoff point. Maybe Gen X as well. Like they're like a cutoff point between 2 points of history or 2 points of kind of anthropological existence or something. You know, they're a kind of cutoff point, and they like so again, if you're a Muslim in the West, you have this identity of being a Muslim, but you don't really have it. The object of being a Muslim is this sort of thing which is in the context of the culture where it originated from. It becomes an identity, and I think the same thing could be said about people today's identities in the West themselves. If you have a kind of identity which is formed in the context of kind of post-war countercultures or something like this, maybe you really like heavy metal music or something, and you wear the t-shirts and you go to the concerts. It's sort of like an identity object. Like you're kind of really, really separated from the actual point of origination by which all of this stuff, which becomes purely aesthetic, kind of actually birthed itself from, right? I think actually a good supplement to this book is Nietzsche's use and abuse of history, because he talks, like Nietzsche will talk about this. He will say that after a certain amount of time in history, we sort of surround ourselves by sort of cultural products. I think he even says something very similar to that, kind of cultural products that are so separated from their kind of point of origin that they become like costumes that we wear, and they don't really make any sense. And every so often we sort of need to strip these costumes off ourselves and get back to the what he calls the supra-historical, which is something which is historical, but it gets to a point of something embodied in history, which is more than just a sort of superficial appearances and conventions of a inherited historical tradition or something. He gets back to it, something essential, something substantive at the basis of that culture, for example. So it would be a very good kind of supplementary essay to read with this. But anyway, um, I'll keep reading from Oliver. He says, in short, the work of art is defined by how we view it. For the craftsman in the Middle Ages, a sculpture for a church was not a work of art, but a product of an act of worship combined with technical skill. As were the religious cantatas performed today in concert halls rather than in churches. Okay, yeah. Do you know what else I'm thinking of here? Like humanistic funerals and humanistic weddings. I fucking hate that stuff. Um, Absolutely can't stand humanistic ceremonies. Like, just do it in a bloody church. Just do it in a church. You know. It's so deprived. This is it's so deprived. It reminds me of Zizek's coffee without caffeine, beer without alcohol observation. Anyway, the vision of art as high culture may have been born in the West, but the extension of the museum model, the market, the art model, the art market, and the artist category have made it fully globally. This is reflected in the enthusiasm of today's Gulf oil monarchies for the extension of the domain of culture and art. Here, of course, is more a matter of kishk than art, but kishk has become the contemporary form of universal art. During the 20th century, the particular status of art was called into question in several ways by the action of the artist, now more important than the work itself. The typical model here remains the urinal of Duchamp, exhibited in the museum, blah, blah, blah. Scroll down. By regarding everything as art, folk art, art naif, primitive art, design, or by the art market that constructs the value of a work by expanding its audience for reasons that may be economic or political. Blah, blah, blah. In contemporary painting and sculpture, the market now defines what counts as a work of art, the ranking of artists. Kunstkompass, it's a German word, put out by a well-known trade magazine, is based solely on the number of exhibitions in which they have taken part. But this is the evolution of the vast trend of deconstructing high culture. Okay, interesting. So the deconstruction of high culture, sort of, I suppose, reduces it to a museum culture. A museum culture, a purely aesthetic sort of, signifier, deprived of its kind of context, its technical skill. I'm also thinking here a little bit of like rock music, how people started making music, like, you have to learn the instrument, to learn the physical skill of an instrument, and eventually you got like kind of techno music, in which you could program these sounds into the computer. So you kept the aesthetic similarity in many ways, but you lose the actual technical skill, which is necessary to actually kind of participate with the culture and so on. So everything's made easier too. I think that's also a product of consumerism. Everything's just made easier. Everything's made more accessible. To make everything as accessible as possible is the aim. And you see a deprivation of the product when everything's made more accessible. It becomes quiche, basically, I think would be a good way to put it. Another interesting point Oliver will make about deculturization is neoliberalism and what neoliberalism does. So I'll just read from this part. Take, for example, the key principle of the neoliberal quest for excellence, the theory of benchmarking, which involves adopting the best practices of techniques observed in the competition in order to standardize practices and performance with respect to a common measure. It therefore implies deculturating a practice. Imagine we find an innovative sales, production, or management technique in the United States or China. We're obviously not going to study Chinese, American, or Japanese culture before imitating it. We will lift the interesting segment out of its cultural context and integrate it into our own practice. sequencing and crafting of good practice is somewhat akin to the genome sequencing, management engineering mirrors biological engineering. Yes, that's a good kind of analogy there. Again, this is one of the products of globalization, is that like you take something, you globalize it, you decontextualize it, um, and it gets standardized under a certain set of practices, um, with respect to a common measure, um, and you kind of get this socially engineered culture, basically, right? It's kind of like a Frankensteinian product, just then imposed over people. Um, okay, so I'll keep reading. The strategy of excellence has two fundamental consequences in relation to culture. It disregards both anthropological culture and high culture. Okay, interesting. All right. So, yeah. So, disregards anthropological culture and high culture. So that's really important because you often see those things as being kind of uh, opposed to each other. Anthropological culture is just like the stupid, boring, kind of mundane things people do in their lives, that they don't think about, or they don't, take into account, or they don't, whatever. It's just kind of the way things are, um, which is always being attacked, of course. Um, um, I was unfortunately, I hope people who know me don't listen to this, but I was unfortunately invited in the past, few years or so, to like these steg parties, which is like it's not a, well, in America you say bachelor, right? But it's like a mixture. It's like a mixed gender bachelor party, basically, right? And I was just like, this is deculturization. It's this kind of constant attack on, um, the fact that you just have a kind of a process of, before men get married they all go on a night out together, or something like that, or this gendered social ritual that you just inherit and you just do it. You don't necessarily think about it too much, and um, there's this kind of demand to think about that the whole time, right? To think about that, like, well, why would you do that? It's exclusionary, and it's backward, and it's not what we do anymore. So there's this kind of forced social awareness that you have to sort of analyze things, like, for example, gender roles, or probably the best example would be gender roles. You have to analyze that and become aware of it and kind of critique it and so forth. But at the same time, this sort of awareness, this sort of critique is very hostile to high culture too. It's not a friend of high culture. It's not like you have a high culture opposed to a sort of barbarous low culture. You know, what we're talking about here, when this kind of neoliberal, socially engineered culture, is a an enemy of both. It's an enemy of the most basic, grounded, and the highest. It's an enemy of both. This is a good point. So I'll keep reading. From the standpoint of anthropological culture, borrowing a good practice certainly does not amount to understanding the cultural context that enabled it. For what would make it conceptually impossible to extract it from its own, for that would make it conceptually impossible to extract it from its own context and transpose it elsewhere. Therein lies all the tension that runs through management experts and the world of work. On one hand, people are prepared to take a culturalist approach. They've long discussed. Sorry, there have long been discussions about Japanese work culture, cultural obstacles to development, the need to consider national cultures or company cultures in developing one's activity, and getting the best out of one's managers. Countless cultural awareness seminars organized to learn how to negotiate in China. But on the other hand, little notice is taken of these lessons, which are more of a box ticking exercise than a rationalization of management practices. Management training seminars for managers, usually in an idyllic setting of a sunny resort, are highly popular, but quality control practices totally disregard the cultural dimension, and let's be honest, the human dimension as well. And these practices never approach individuals holistically in their relationship to the world, which is precisely in the field of culture. Professional activity. Um, Professional activity is chopped into discontinuous sequences that are each subject to a quantified assessment according to a pre-established grid with the aim to standardize and equalize work practices and actions. Deculturation thus ends with dehumanization. If the theory of excellence entirely fails to take high culture into account, it is precisely because the high culture cannot be sequenced without being adulterated, because it remains deeply rooted in national culture, or at least linguistic spaces. A book written by an influential British education secretary that claims to be a textbook for excellence in schools never mentions culture as a criterion except as an allusion to hobbies. Good schools make substantial provision for extracurricular activities, including sports, the arts, voluntary activities, and other after-school activities. All other criteria of excellence are purely functional. Teacher-student ratio, the role of parents, and always the emphasis on personal achievement, blah, blah, blah. Adherence to the Shanghai criteria has led universities to self-deculturate with the blessing of right-wing governments. A nation's culture now boils down to heritage, remembrance, tradition, and conservation. In other words, a museum. This is very Nietzschean, actually. It's funny because I was listening to an interview with Olivier Roy and someone else recently, I think a kind of conservative American academic, and the conservative American academic kept criticizing the the common problem that both people were pointing to here as a kind of Nietzscheanism, a kind of transhumanist Nietzscheism or something like this. But no, but like Nietzsche is completely compatible with these sorts of critiques. Again, read his use and abuse of histories. He talks about museum culture and so on. So this is really good. But anyway, yeah, I like this point that the Shanghai criteria has led universities to self-deculturate with the blessing of right-wing governments. Yeah, this kind of standardization of practice, this I suppose it's kind of competing with others in a kind of self-depriving manner. It's competing, but it's not competing to be the best. It's competing to be the most accommodating of a certain deculturating standard of practices, right? Bloated administrative faculties, and it's kind of things Mark Fisher would talk about as well, like a kind of obsession with metrics and trying to constantly ground everything we do in the kind of metric justification. If something we do can't be shown, if we can't prove in exam results, for example, the or successful job appointments after graduating or something like this, then there's a kind of tendency to say, well, this is pointless, right? Which is a really, really stupid and terrible way to think, for obvious reasons. Well, one good point he makes here about imaginaries. I'm just kind of skipping through the book and looking at notes I took and just kind of pointing out these observations in different areas. But he says neither high culture nor anthropological culture provide the stuff of dreams today. Ways of believing now come within the realms of subcultures. They are associated with sex, fandoms, conspiracy theories, and the like. The end of grand ideologies has also been a defeat for the imagination, just as secularization has been, as it leaves no other foundation for the political order than a theory of the social contract at odds with everyday experience. Secularism in the 19th century claimed to be as much a form of spirituality as an ode to rationality and science, the synthesis central to the tenets of Freemasonry. Today, it is no more than a normative code that cannot provide an alternative to religious drifts other than to exclude religion. Imaginaries are thus relegated to the margins of societies, leaving the grand narratives in the hands of radicals, the example of the bellicose reinterpretation of the jihad being the most striking. Without a common imaginary, it is hard to project oneself onto the future. For the first time, a cause mobilizing youth, the fight against climate change, is driven not by hope but by fear. It is not utopia but the nostalgia for the earth before the advent of Homo sapiens. Okay, yeah. There's also a strand in it, in this book, which is very critical of the kind of um, uh, way in which young people's sort of imaginaries and their sort of political visions has turned away from utopia. Isn't to say that utopias aren't problematic in various. Even the word problematic is terrible. I hate that word. I shouldn't have said that. I'm brainwashed a little bit by neoliberalism. Um, but obviously utopias can lead to a lot of stupid ideas which get implemented sometimes. But there has been a shift away from utopia to kind of a mixture between, I think, apocalypticism or nostalgia, or a bit of both. I'm a little bit more sympathetic of the nostalgia, um, but you know, certainly apocalypticism is a very peculiar trend among young people today. Um, and Oliver will bring this phenomena out in order to show us how the imagination has been sort of deprived, um, in how we envision the future, obviously, from um, I suppose what he's saying is the marginalization of religion, which is not new, right? If you think about this, it's not new. Religion has been marginalized for a few hundred years, at least, um, in one form or another. I mean, in countries like where I'm from, Ireland, it's quite recent. But if you go to France or England or Germany or something, or America, you have a church and state dynamic which is pretty strict and pretty concrete, and that's kind of that's almost like the very basis of the modern kind of enlightened state, right? So, um, this exclusion of the religious has led to a crisis of the imaginary, and left the imaginary in the hands of the fringes. People on the fringes has kind of excluded it, which has had interesting consequences. One of that being religious fundamentalism, one of that being conspiracy theories, one of that being fandoms, um, and so forth. So that's some more interesting byproducts of deculturization. I want to just read a little bit from one part, which is kind of on the more political stuff, which is kind of on the kind of identity politics. And so one chapter is called "Suffering and Reparation: From Revolution to Human Rights," and he basically in this part will quite accurately, I think, point out the more revolutionary tendencies which the modern world had up until relatively recently have been really replaced by this kind of remedial demands. Like, politics is kind of progressive politics is about, or radical politics, whatever way you want to put it, is about remedial demands to sort of alleviate suffering and so forth. I mean, the best example of this is obviously like the sort of obsession with emotional harm, um, that is very common, has become very common in the past, I don't know, whatever, 10, 15 years, um, to kind of view that as a political category, to view the remedying of emotional harm as a kind of political aspiration is a completely weird and novel way to think. But there's one part here called "The End of Politics," which I think is worth reading out. Okay, the depoliticization of struggles renders any utopia powerless. Utopia has been replaced by moral judgment and support for categorical causes. Categorical there. Anyway, Trump's America is symptomatic of this, as are the two places of protest to which it gave rise: the street corner where a black man was killed by the police, and the university campus. But the Black Lives Matter and cancel culture activists are strangely absent from the arena of politics itself. The vocal students of 1960s left their campuses to demonstrate alongside black people and to encourage the disenfranchised to register to vote. Blah, 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 blah. Today, they demand a safe space for them to shelter them from violence at once physical, which is understandable, and crucially symbolic or psychological, emotional violence. Yeah. But in doing so, they remove themselves from other struggles. The intersectionality so much discussed on campus is not the conjunction of struggles of oppressed groups, but the presence of a single person of many different predicates taken from different categories. Yeah. Every every definition of a person seems to come down to a person with predicates, a person with a uterus, a person with a disability, blah blah blah, thereby segmenting any collective into more restrictive subgroups until we are left with one person in their singular uniqueness. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, I'm laughing because I kind of recognize that process. Um, this is just how insufferable and impossible the left is today. I would be I know it's not true, but I often just feel like I don't know, like the CIA just like controls the entire left or something in the past 20 years or 15 years. It just controls the entire. Because this is exactly what happens. Any space for solidarity, for a shared vision or a shared cause or shared set of principles is replaced by just sort of subcategory and 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 subcategory, of which all turns into this brutal social competition by which the person with the most subcategory predicates, a person with this, a person with that, a person deprived of this, a person who is this, a person who has experienced that. If you have the most subcategory predicates, you're like the winner. You're like the absolute winner. You're like you win the suffering Olympics and you're the winner. And it's unhealthy because it's obviously a kind of relation to suffering in which it's completely stripped of any overcoming or any kind of integrity. But it's also and sort of sees suffering as a kind of identity marker rather than a situation to be overcome. It views it, or a kind of tragic aspect, a kind of universal tragic aspect to human existence or something like that. It views suffering as a sort of a social weapon, a sort of identity category slash social weapon to like wield. I think in order to extract social resources, basically, I think this is what they want to do. You see, I think that again, this is my own idea. It's less so Olivier, but it's connected. I think what the point of the left in the past 10 years or something is to kind of create these sort of identity categories of demands for suffering appeasement and remedial care, which are basically designed around social resource extraction. Not for some great cause, not for some collective purpose, or with fidelity to anything of any value, but just narcissistically for oneself. That's it. I think that's basically the point. But anyway, the left is dead, and if it ever comes back, it will come back in a completely different form anyway. So that's not here or there. But anyway, yeah, good observations, I think, around the kind of end of politics into a kind of identitarian demands for remedial care and so forth. I think these are all pretty good. So I'll read out one more point. He says the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum, herself very active in social struggles, discusses the observable depoliticization of the new demands and increasing the position of Butler, I think it's Judith Butler, the philosopher of gender. Yeah. The tragedy in the great new feminist theory in America is the loss of the sense of public commitment. Yeah. Butlerian feminism is in many ways easier than the old feminism. It tells scores of talented young women that they need to work on changing the law, or feeding the hungry, or assailing power through theory harnessed to material politics. They can do politics in the safety of their campuses, remaining on the symbolic level, making subversive gestures at power through speech and gesture. Yeah, so I mean, it's a kind of purely symbolic form of politics, which signaling, virtue signaling as it's typically called, signaling and linguistic restructuring can all be done, and sort of a kind of silly. I'm a bit of a theory cell. I like theory, but I am also aware that you need to sort of experienced a healthy dose of social reality and other sorts of realities, really to ground your theory in anything genuine, especially if it's social theory. It's a bit different if you're talking about metaphysics, or if you're talking about cosmology or metaphysics, or macro historical processes, which have largely happened in times where no one really has experienced but if you're doing social theory and you're doing political theory, like you really should be have some experience in kind of grounded involvement. But they don't do that anymore. They just stay in their campuses and they do this kind of symbolic work. It's purely symbolic work. Um, and they ruin everything in doing it, because they create this horrible administrative processes of controlling people's language and speech, and they and they go and they make films. Like if they get involved in Hollywood, they go and they make these terrible TV shows, these terrible films, and so on and so forth. But just another note on the I think this is a very good point uh, on this kind of perpetual categorization, category creating thing, right? Deculturation tends to kind of take a holistic perspective and reduce it to this kind of set of subcategories and subcategories and subcategories. So I was reading, well, kind of rereading, because I skimmed over it a while ago, but Aristotle's Politics, and the first thing he says in it is the city is prior to the individual, and the city is prior to the family. Like, you don't look at it from the perspective of you have individuals and they get together and they make a city. Your families, individuals, and they get together and they make a family, and then the families get together and they make a city. No. The city is prior. The whole is prior to the individual part. And this kind of old way of holistically thinking of things is completely gone. It's completely been deprived. So you have this process of like, kind of carving out a kind of identitarian subcategory, and kind of depriving of any kind of holistic understanding, and then sort of making these remedial demands based on that. This can happen in kind of progressive ways. It could be kind of feminist, or it could be LGBT or something, but it can also happen in conservative ways, like a masculinist movement, right? Is often, even though I think a lot of their complaints nowadays are probably quite valid, but still, nonetheless, you don't want to sort of understand yourself as an identity which is like detached from the rest of society and culture, because it's just kind of theoretically stupid, and what it's going to lead to is a kind of subcategorization of the identity, and it's kind of inherently depoliticized. It's kind of innately or inherently depoliticized. I think this is why these social tensions which happen, are expressed then through creating a sort of identitarian subcategory, and then kind of just sort of obsessing over the identity, and then sort of expanding the identity, and then integrating people into the identity, and then arguing with other identities, but it never really leads to a proper political engagement on one hand, or a sort of classical sort of theoretical paradigm, making a kind of rejuvenation of a larger theoretical paradigm of society from the perspective of a particular, because that can happen. Like Marxism, for example, will say that here's a macro historical sort of holistic theory of history and society and politics, and also and so on. But we're going to look at this through the particular lens of the proletariat, who are kind of revolutionary subjectivity. And we're like, through that lens, the sort of whole can be seen. But you have to also theorize about the whole, and then engage it through a particular. But that's not what happens today. You don't have a particular sort of being a subjectivity in which you can see a whole. You just have an never-ending subcategorization of particulars and particulars and particulars and so on and so forth, which is actually what happened to Protestantism. You know? They just had like a million different sects splitting off and splitting off and splitting off and splitting off. There's another section which I can't actually find my notes on, but it's to do with psychology and the turn from psychoanalysis to behavioralism and cognitivism, and kind of, you know, it kind of repeats the same trends that we were talking about within this, and says, you know, the move from psychoanalysis, which is all about the unconscious and the implicit, is replaced by this kind of very vulgar categorization of you know, disorder, disease. It's again, you're going to have this process of categorization. It's kind of categorization into subcategorization. It's a diagnostic categorization process, rather than just looking at like a person holistically, as psychoanalysis attempted to do. Maybe not enough. I actually think that it didn't do this good enough, which is part of the problem. But it still did it way better than any other kind of school of psychology, where you look at someone holistically, you look at their mind holistically, you look at their personal history holistically, you look at their relationship to society holistically. You know, you sort of take into account various different you know, various different dynamics, various different relationships, various different historical experiences, which sort of make up that person's mind, make up that person's you know, subjectivity, their everything, personality, and of course you're dealing with an implicit, you're dealing with an unconscious, and you get a very vulgar replacement of, well, these are, you know, good thoughts and bad thoughts, positive thinking, negative thinking, and and then through psychiatry you have this very vulgar diagnostic subcategorization, right? And like, look, this psychiatric subcategorization process is horrendous, because what it does, and I've seen this personally, I know people that are like this. They get given an identity. They go in and they have a problem, and fair enough, they need some help, and they get given a kind of diagnostic identity, and this diagnostic identity then becomes like their identity, and they reduce themselves to that. And anyone who sort of threatens that or questions that is treated in this very hostile way. They're treated like as if you're like physically hurting them, you're physically attacking them. This is where it ultimately ends up. Which again is this kind of strange sort of tendency, you know, to sort of equate psychological stress with a physical attack, and so on and so on and so on. But yeah, no, it's awful. But again, I guess the point here simply is that you can view the move from psychoanalysis to behavioralism or cognitivism as a process of deculturization. Okay, so just before I finish, I think that was pretty much covers most of the interesting things. I want to read the very last page, half page. He says, how do we make a culture? How do we reconstruct a social bond that is grounded in a shared imaginary? How do we rediscover being part of a community? Authoritarian pedagogy. So this is maybe something I skipped over a little bit, was that he thinks that, and this is a very good point, he thinks that if you live long enough in a decultured society, you go through a decultured process, you get this norm production response, you eventually get to what he calls authoritarian pedagogy. Okay, and authoritarian pedagogy is basically like this excessively restrictive and controlling set of explicit norms. Do this, don't do this, and I would just point out they're also very contradictory. This is something I think he doesn't point out enough in this book, which is that the norms are very, very contradictory, and internally incoherent a lot of the time. Which is even worse than it's an even worse form of authoritarianism. It's like a kind of Kafkaesque authoritarianism. But anyway, it leads to what he's calling a kind of authoritarian pedagogy. And he points out as well that pedagogy has never created culture. Like, it does help in structure it and transmit it, and create certain processes within a culture, but it never creates it. So like this is one of the reasons why he doesn't think that what we're seeing with the norm the norm producing machinery excuse me, of our time is going to create a kind of is going to create a genuine new era, which sort of just answered the question some people had. I remember when they were discussing things like wokeness a few years ago, people were saying, is this the new world we're going to live in for 1,000 years, like Christianity? Is this the new Christianity? But no, because no, and I think we're already seeing no, because it's too incoherent, and it's a form of authoritarian pedagogy um that has never created a culture. Has never created a culture. It does other things, of course, but it doesn't create a culture. He was asked in an interview that I watched recently. He was asked if it's possible that what we're seeing with a lot of this stuff is a bit punitive. It's a bit harsh. I mean, in the context here, they were talking about things to do with racial relations and gender relations in the kind of progressive version of the authoritarian pedagogy. And he was asked by somebody interviewing him. He was like kind of playing devil's advocate. Is it possible that this is just a sort of a bit of a punitive phase that we're going through in order to sort of entrench a new morality in people that's different from the old morality, and that once that's done, it will be less punitive because it will kind of be more internalized, and you'll have the movement from an explicit to an implicit. And he says categorically no, because pedagogy has never created a culture, right? So he's very much based in this sort of I suppose the sort of school of thought, you could say, in which it's really anthropology and high culture that creates culture. It's anthropology and high culture that creates culture. It's not pedagogy. You can have pedagogy, of course, but pedagogy has to be embedded in culture and embedded in anthropology and embedded in high culture. It can't be just this kind of deculturated norm producing process that's never created a culture, and he thinks it never will. So to answer your question, if anyone fears that this sort of peculiar phase that we're going through in society will be lasting of 1,000 years or something, well, then I wouldn't worry too much about that. I don't think that's going to happen. It might get worse, but it's not going to last 1,000 years, So yeah. So that's not gonna happen. Which is in some sense, a skepticism of pedagogy itself, but which may make people feel sort of like, oh, we have no power then to influence people or to shape and form people. Oh, but the same sense is actually a very optimistic view, because it shows you that the authoritarianism is gonna probably collapse and break at a certain point. And then again in the same interview, he pointed out, well, he said, take a look at the Soviet Union. Like, originally you had these great ideals about equality, about material, about the communist revolution, and then after a certain amount of time, you started to get this kind of authoritarian pedagogy be kind of trying to sort of maintain those ideals purely through a kind of authoritarian imposition on people, a kind of punitive authoritarian imposition on people. And it didn't work. It didn't work. The entire society collapsed after a certain amount of time, which might make you a bit scared if you're living in the West today, because maybe the same thing can happen to us. Which he wouldn't be the only person to point that out. Even people like Niall Ferguson, like total like liberals, are pointing out the similarities. So, good news and bad news, I suppose. But anyway, I'll keep reading. Authoritarian pedagogy has never produced culture. Yeah, he says there. At most, it's generated a conformity of practices and indifference to values that have become simple mantras. Common to the normative systems of the kind described in this book is a deep distrust of human nature and human beings, even though the systems themselves are in part a product of the optimistic vision of the 60s, in which desiring individuals achieve self-fulfillment through harmonious encounters with others. But the normative systems that are being established in the name of this freedom are dehumanizing. Okay, I'll stop there for a second. That's a good point. So again, quite similarly to the Soviet Union, like, you began with this enthusiastic burst of idealism, and it's more open. It's more culturally grounded. It's more open. It's more anthropologically grounded in certain ways. It's more open. It's more optimistic. But then eventually, again, there's a kind of failure to transmit it, or there's a failure of it itself, and there's a kind of pushing. It pushed on people. It's pushed on younger people in particular, I think, in a way which is kind of authoritarian and dehumanizing. So there's a kind of life cycle crisis which he's describing here. Okay, so but the normal systems are established. Yeah, they treat individuals as though they were infantile, selfish, and incapable of understanding what is good for them, as they prey on the earth, on animals, and each other. Again, a very good point. Olivier, he's not a super radical kind of guy, and he's not he's not his aim. He kind of works within kind of relatively mainstream academic institutions. And the publisher for this book is probably a relatively slightly spicy, maybe slightly adventurous sort of academic publisher or something. I don't know. I haven't looked at the publishing company that does it or anything, but these are really, really good and quite courageous observations to point out, especially from an academic's perspective, because his bloody profession are some of the most guilty people in all of this, right? So this is quite optimistic to see someone write like this. So it's dehumanizing. It treats people like infants, selfish, and capable of understanding what's good for them, as they prey on the earth, on animals, on each other. It's kind of ecological morality, of course, where humans are just these parasites who have to be controlled, because otherwise they're just going to destroy the world, and blah 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 blah. Where really actually that's more just to do with our sort of industrial processes of production, which really is largely out of the control of any individual. It's a systemic problem that can only be controlled, I think, in a quite morally neutral way, just by government regulation, basically. I mean, just because I work in a job where I teach English language, so I'm not like it's not like I'm not really involved in anything like this, but I remember teaching a class that I was working for a school, and I had to teach a class, and it was like on environmentalism or something, and I was asking people, the class, like, what do you think is a good way to help the environment? And so many of them were saying, oh, we need to control individual behavior. People need to be educated. People need to be educated into recycling more, or they need to be educated into being more aware of the damage that we do upon the earth and all this kind of stuff. And I was just thinking, this is a horrible view. This is just terrible. Literally, the only way to deal with this stuff is very morally neutral government regulation, of particularly of big industries that produce, things, set up incentives for people, to recycle bottles. You go to the supermarket, you throw your bottles in there, and you get a token. You get if you get €10 off your shopping or something. Those things are perfectly good. I actually think the Germans have a good model of the recycling thing, because it is kind of morally neutral. I mean, it's kind of it kind of feeds into an autistic sensibility to just put things in the proper place. It's not very moralistic. They don't kind of try to look into your soul. They just sort of incentivize it, and it's kind of it's like the kind of the most morally neutral ways possible are probably the best thing to deal with something like ecology. But you get in this process of deculturization and norm creating a kind of attempt to use certain crises like ecology, or climate change, for example, as an excuse to sort of look into people's souls and say, you are these disgusting parasitical human beings, and you must be morally surveilled. It's it's really gross. Anyway, um, okay. How are we to understand this contrast between the optimism of the premises and the pessimism of the conclusions? First, we have seen what is now looming on the horizon is not utopia but apocalypse, a variety for us to choose from our playlist of the future world. Global warming, civil war, the great replacement, a third or fourth world war, the return of the Antichrist, epidemics far worse than those we have gone before, or simply old age and death. The care home is now central to debates on Western civilization. Yeah. Meanwhile, both deep ecology and anti-speciesism um, merely acknowledge the real, imagined, or even desired disappearance of human beings from a planet that has gone off course and is spinning out of control. What we are living through right now is a true crisis of humanism. Okay, yeah. So it's really a crisis of the human being's kind of future, its history, its past, its existence, its ontology, its soul, its social everything. It's a complete fucking shit show, basically. What he's trying to say. Um, uh, yeah, and like you're not gonna fix it through authoritarian pedagogy and norm creating processes is what he's basically arguing here. Yeah, I would definitely recommend this book. Um, it's quite good. Um, I don't really have a lot of criticisms of it. I think he could have defined the culture more to begin with. It's kind of a bit annoying when you're going into this theory of deculturization, but you don't really spend a lot of time like thoroughly defining culture. It's uh, uh, you know obviously he's against kind of making it explicit. Culture is not an act of explicit; it's an implicit. But so defining it might be contradictory to that. But still, I think you got to put some effort into showing us like what a culture actually is before you go in a big book about deculturization. Um, but anyway, I think it was pretty good. Other than that, he does sort of criticize um, right wing populism and kind of progressive identity politics quite equally. I mean, I sort of focus more on his criticisms of the progressive stuff just because I think those parts are more interesting. But I would just point out that I think one mistake some people just make, and it could be the product of their it could be the product of their job or something, or their role in a university and trying to protect their reputation and career and stuff, is that like the populism stuff is a reaction. Like it is a reaction to the progressive identitarian pedagogy stuff. It is a reaction to that. They don't just both come about equally at the same time. There's a one thing comes first, and then there's reaction to that. So it's worth keeping in mind because it's not always that they're exactly equal. Not that I'm a populist or anything. I'm actually not. Um, and I am quite increasingly critical of populism because I do think it's falling into the same issues which its supposed enemies, are guilty of. Probably because because it's just kind of mimicking it in certain ways. It's kind of reframing it, mimicking it, and reframing it for different reasons for different people, so on and so forth. But it does begin with the left. I think it really does. Um, okay, yeah, great book. Recommend it. Thank you for listening.